Yes, again, thank you guys so much for joining us in last talk. I mean, could be at the bar already, but you're here. And so this talk is a Red Team Apocalypse. The idea of this talk kind of came from another talk that I did a few years ago to B-Sides Conference. The original concept was pen test apocalypse, and in that talk, I kind of walked through the top 10 things that we find on penetration tests. And there were things that I was able to list out, and a lot of organizations that we pen test today like go fix that stuff before we pen test them. So we were forced to find new things, and out of that came the idea of doing this Red Team Apocalypse talk, which is kind of like the next, like it's not even 10 things, it's more than 10 things. We're going to cram a lot of stuff in. You're going to get a lot of information from this, hopefully. And yeah, it's basically the next step.
So how many people do regular pen testing at their companies? So, hopefully it went well for you. So, how many people use an endpoint detection and response type Cyber-APT-Blinky-Box thing, right? So what would you do if you came in one morning on a Monday and you got your coffee and you sat down and you found out that your sensitive database is being sold on the dark web? See if I can get one more buzzword in there. So that's what this talk's about. Like, how would an attacker, if you're doing all the things that you thought you were supposed to be doing, you're getting annual pen tests, you have defense in depth, yet somehow you still got compromised. How did that happen? So a little bit about us. We work for Black Hills Information Security. I'm Derek Banks.
I'm Beau Bullock.
And so we're pen testers. We do red teams together. In fact, I'm going to let Beau tell you about this picture.
Yeah, so this is actually from a red team engagement we went on. We were testing a music industry company, and I got our owner, John Strand, to let me expense in a guitar to have a ruse to go in with musicians. It was awesome. So we broke into a building with guitars. It was pretty good. My wife wasn't happy with the security footage later. A picture of me with like, guitars and me and him, and just, yeah, it looked bad. It looked like one of those things that, you'd see on the news.
Yeah, so we actually hung out in the practice room that they had set aside for musicians for, like 4 or 5 hours actually playing music, and then waited for everybody to go home, and then started going around and trying to get into people's computers.
Unlock workstations,
Yeah,
fun
passwords
stuff.
on Post-it notes. There was actually a live jack in that room too, which was pretty fun. So
there were some pretty sweet amps in that building too.
Yeah, there was.
So we go back one slide real quick. We also do, we started a few meetups, so CitySec meetups, if you're familiar with like the Reddit CitySec thing. So if you're ever in Florida, there's Tampa and Orlando, and he's got Tidewater Sec.
Yeah,
here.
so normally when I ask this question, nobody raises their hand, but how many people are here from Virginia? Oh yeah, right, okay. So normally that's not the case. So if you're down in the peninsula area, Newport News and Hampton, we have a local meetup, it's the same thing. We get together once a month, hang out at the bar and talk about security, computers, whatever. Oh, also, how many people use Office web app? That's a lot
Outlook.
less than it used to be. So
Really? Outlook web app? Yeah. Come on, there should be some more hands than that.
Oh, well, good on you, because that's actually one of my favorite Microsoft products.
Yes. We'll talk about that some more soon. Okay, so this slide is basically a condensed version of an entire 60-minute talk. So I'll go through this really quickly. This was the original pen test apocalypse, top 10 things that we kind of found on assessments, and one of these is actually 2 things. That's why you only see 9 slides there. So vulnerability management, of course, like finding exploitable services is a very common thing we find at pen tests. Group policy preferences. So it used to be whenever you created a local admin user with a GPP, that it would actually store that credential in a reversible format on a share that's accessible by everybody. And we still find it very often today. It's one of the first things we always look for on pen tests is just go see if there's clear text credentials in GPP files. Widespread local administrator accounts, so this is your typical, we have the same local admin user on every workstation, and when that's the case, we can pass the hash of that user, if they're not randomizing the local administrator credential. Weak passwords, this is something we still find all the time. We do what's called password spraying attacks against networks, where we basically take the entire user list and then perform an authentication attempt, one authentication attempt for each of those users, so that we're not locking anybody out, but it enables us to do things like perform thousands of login attempts for a single password, something like summer 2017 or common passwords like company name 123.
It's actually summer
2018.
now.
Yeah, you're right. Overprivileged users, so having users that are already admin of their system is something we find pretty often. And also, so this would be the other, this is the one that has two different meanings. So the overprivileged users of your local system, and then overprivileged users on the domain. So a lot of times we'll find that users have been added to groups such as local admins that are members of the domain users group. So domain users group gets added to local admins. And when that happens, we'll find that workstation on the network. And domain users, if everyone's a member of domain users, so you're now a local admin of that system. Sensitive data and file shares, this is exactly the title, right? Finding things on the network that shouldn't be in files, like finding passwords in document files, finding databases that are just accessible, finding images of virtual machines that are accessible that I can go download and extract credentials from. Intranet information disclosure. So this is something that actually is really fun to find when you're actually pen testing a company that uses something like Office 365 and you get a credential to access something like SharePoint. Now you can go look for things like, how do I VPN into the organization? And oftentimes we'll find that documentation is there. And in many cases, the items you need are there too, like keys, like if you need like a second factor that's like a workstation key. NetBIOS and LLM&R poisoning. This is your responder attack. If you're familiar with the tool Responder, it basically will respond to LLM&R and NetBIOS queries and allow you to obtain net and TLM v2 hashes. And lastly, local workstation privilege escalation. So oftentimes we'll find that we can escalate privileges locally through various misconfigured services, the ability to hijack different DLLs, and yeah, that's pretty much the top 10 pen test apocalypse stuff. So now we're on to the red team.
Yeah, so all that stuff still actually works, but what's the difference between a red team and a pen test and a red team anyway? Does anybody know what the difference is? So it's probably, it could be sort of like a religious debate, right? Like red teams have to have like physical aspects and stuff. Yeah, so maybe. So this is sort of my opinion, and I think the pirates versus ninja analogy is apt. And that actually comes from Rapid7, but I look at a pen test. The goal of a pen test is to find as many vulnerabilities in the environment as possible in the amount of time that you have allotted for the pen test. So that's why I use something like a vulnerability scanner like Nessus. You're actually looking to cover as much ground to get some of that low-hanging fruit that we were talking about before. Well, a red team, in my opinion, a red team is goal-oriented. So that's more like an assassin or a ninja. You have one goal in mind, and the goal of that red team is to go find the company's sensitive data and access it in any means necessary. Now that might mean that you go to physically on site. It may not. You may even model a threat actor if that's an appropriate thing for the red team that you're at. And so pirates versus ninjas, I think pen test is loud, it's noisy, just like pirates. Maybe the pen testers are drunk like pirates. I don't know. Then a red team, you're stealthy. You're not. You don't want to get caught. You care about getting caught. Because if you get caught, well, that's pretty much the end of the red team, right? So it's silent, like a ninja. So how would you go about conducting a red team? So this is sort of a condensed methodology. The first phase is reconnaissance. You have to know your target. You have to know the employees that work there, what the business does. Recon is probably one of the most important steps, and actually, if done properly, takes a little bit of time to do. Next, you have to gain some kind of foothold in the environment, and we'll call that compromise, exploitation, whatever. So that's getting some kind of code execution or some kind of access to assets that are going to lead you to sensitive data eventually. Then persistence. I think that a proper red team, you're going to establish some kind of quote long-term backdoor. It's probably not long-term, but you want some way to maintain access into the environment, whether that's the VPN that we maybe got out of email, or if that's some kind of command and control system like a backdoor. And then after that, asset discovery. So that's more like internal reconnaissance, like finding out what's going on inside the network, where those servers or databases that you're trying to go after, where they live. Typically, to do that, you'll need to escalate your privileges in some manner, right? You'll need to be a database administrator. You'll need to be some kind of administrator to get there. And then you'll move laterally through the network. So going to workstation or workstation to server through some means. And then finally, we'll call it actions on objectives. Yes, I did steal that from a trademarked thing, but okay. And what I mean by that is that you go get that data and maybe do like a mock exfiltration, whatever the point of contact of the client wants you to do. If it's just gaining access, if it's copying it to your machine, whatever. So that's how a threat actor, in my opinion, would go about conducting an actual attack, which you're modeling in the red team.
Okay, so we're actually getting into the actual techniques and tactics at this point. A lot of this stuff I think we're probably going to go through pretty quickly because we have a lot of stuff to cover. We, as an organization, have been doing a lot of research into attacking G Suite lately, just because we've had a number of customers that we've come up against that are, they're using G Suite for everything, email, sharing data. And so through that, we have developed a few different techniques for trying to attack those types of organizations that are utilizing G Suite. So I'm going to walk through a few of these real quick. All right, so Google Hangouts ruse. So you remember like whenever you used to try to chat with somebody in Gmail, they used to get this little pop-up that said, hey, so-and-so wants to be able to chat with you. Is that okay? So apparently this was too much for some users. It was like too much work to click the yes button because now by default, it just lets you pop up a message to anybody. If you create a Gmail account today, you have to go actually change your default setting to make it so that it requires an invite for you to accept. But now the default is that I can literally just open up a message, and oh yeah, I can make it look like Google Security is talking to you too. So by just changing your name, so the email address doesn't even get shown in Hangouts anymore. So this creates a pretty fun social engineering opportunity here, where you can now pop a message box open to somebody. And say, hey, click this link because, whatever, like back up your security codes or something. Even if you have like the invite enabled, you can still make it look really legit. Like, so this is a new Hangout invite from Google Security with a logo and everything. Let's hang out. Like, there's nothing indicative of maliciousness there. And so, like, somebody who's not really paying attention might just click accept. And now, kind of think of this same concept, but mimicking somebody they have a relationship with, somebody that they work with. Just grab their profile picture, use that and their name, and now you are them talking to them through Hangouts. So it creates a very interesting social engineering aspect. And the other thing that kind of is really bad about this is there doesn't really appear to be a global option within Google G Suite to lock that down so that it requires everyone to require an invite. Another thing is this Google Doc ruse. So this is another social engineering thing. These three things that I'm going to talk about are primarily social engineering avenues. So this one is basically creating a Google Doc with a title something like, critical update pending. So you're creating a Gmail doc, right? You add content that looks like a terms of service update or something or whatever, and then you know how you can create a comment in the Google Doc, like you can tag people in that comment. So if you tag somebody in a Google Docs or an email address from at docs.google.com, we'll send them an email. So like this is the comment box, right? So like you have your typical comment box on the right there, and if I assign that task or that comment to somebody, Google will then email them. So this is a fun situation where you can have an actual phishing URL sent from Google. So they would get an email that looks something like this. It looks like it's coming from Google Security that says, your account will be deactivated unless you review the updated terms of service located here. And you could use like a Google shortened URL to send them to. Calendar event injection. So this is a fun one. So this one we actually reported to Google, and they said it's just a feature, so they're not going to fix it. So whenever you go to add a new event in Google Calendar, it gives you the option of sending them an invite, right? And if you don't send them an invite, then it will still add it to their calendar, but not send them an email. So you can add things to any Google user's calendar without sending them an email. So first off, that's kind of interesting, right? Because then I can make something alert in your face, because it's going to pop up on your phone and say, hey, you have a meeting in 10 minutes. Check this agenda before the meeting. And again, like, make it look like it came from somebody they know. Include a link to a conference call. And, you could even, so like this gets deep too, because a lot of the G Suite customers we use implement two-factor. They use like Google two-factor. So one of our employees, Mike Felch, wrote Cred Sniper, which is really amazing at capturing those two-factor codes. So on our phishing page, not only are we capturing credentials, but we're also prompting that user for that two-factor code, getting the two-factor code on the back end. We're logging in, redirecting them to another Google page, and now we're logged in, bypassing two-factor on the backside. So with the event injection thing, the thing that's kind of fun too is like you can make it look like they accepted the invite. So Google's API allows you to actually create an event in their calendar that looks like they actually accepted the invite that you sent them without them ever actually sending an email. So another fun phishing opportunity, right? You pop up an alert that says, hey, you need to read this agenda before this meeting.
Sounds like a feature to me.
Yes. There you go.
So, traditionally, business email compromise is doing some of those same things, but getting into an email box, right, or getting into someone's email. And we were asking about OA earlier. This is actually why we like OA so much, is because typically we find it not two-factor enabled. And even if it is two-factor enabled, there's certain circumstances, services on by default, that let us just bypass that. So, a lot of times, email services or internal exchange, something like that, sometimes pen testers sort of overlook that. I mean, it's the business email, right? Threat actors and red teamers do not. There's so much information in email that it's an information goldmine. We found, like Beau was saying earlier, basically usernames and passwords and the second factor of like certificates to VPN in as a user, which is amazing to me why that's in email to begin with, but that's a different story.
Yeah, so when we're doing any sort of external assessment, like if we're doing a red team assessment, we are targeting anything that has to do with like NTLM authentication really hard, because we love to get any sort of credential that might allow us to actually log into OA and read email. And the great thing about OA is it does have a number of services. So whenever you set up an Exchange server with Outlook Web Access, it not only has that web portal that you're familiar with, but it also has this thing called Exchange Web Services, which is right alongside it. And one of the things that we found is that some two-factor softwares only protect that normal web app portal, but right alongside it is Exchange Web Services that gives you the same access.
Yeah, when we reported that to Microsoft, they said that was a feature and they're not going to fix it.
Yeah. So that out of that whole thing kind of spawned a tool called Mail Sniper that we wrote. And that tool does a number of different things. First off, it does domain username enumeration. So we can tell if a username or a domain is valid for an organization, like an internal domain and an internal username, based off of timing responses from the web application, from OA. So if you submit a username that's invalid, it might take 300 milliseconds. A valid one might take 1,000 milliseconds to come back. So through timing attacks, we're able to enumerate those usernames. Another thing is this tool also does password spraying. So we were talking about password spraying earlier, taking like an entire list. So what we'll typically do is do some recon, find a bunch of employee names from LinkedIn, create a list, and then try one attempt for each of those. And then once we have a valid cred, with OA, you're able to get the global address list. So now, with a single cred, we're able to go and download the entire global address list, which contains all the emails for the entire domain. Then, perform more password spraying with that list. And then one thing that I thought was pretty interesting is this open inbox delegation thing. So there's a module called Open Inbox Finder in Mail Sniper that allows you to find users who have delegated access to their inbox. And it's amazing how many people actually just delegate access. And the reason is because it's a very easy thing to do. All you have to do is open up Outlook, right-click your inbox, and click Properties. And there's a setting right there that allows you to it's called, what's the name? Reviewer. Reviewer access to your email. If you provide what they consider, I think it's, anonymous access to have reviewer privileges, then that essentially grants domain users in your environment access to read your email. And we found like where the entire domain has access to the CEO's email at the company. And then the other thing that the tool does, and this is actually the original thing that we wrote the tool for, was searching for sensitive data in email. So like he was saying, like with email, people send all kinds of awesome stuff in email. We'll search it for passwords, for any sensitive data that we might be looking for that assessment. The next slide actually includes a kind of a flow of exactly what I was just talking about. So starting with nothing, moving on to recon, finding the actual mail server, and a lot of this translates to O365 too, by the way. Do internal domain enumeration, username convention discovery, username enumeration, password spraying, get the global address list, more password spraying, and then like I mentioned before, if they're using 2FA on OA, then we might be able to bypass 2FA by connecting to EWS, Exchange Web Services, and then look for various things like remote access through VPNs. You can do malicious Outlook rules and employee-to-employee phishing. That's one of the key things too. Is once you have access from a single employee, phishing to other employees as somebody they know, or jump into like a conversation they already have started, you have a lot higher chances of success.
So this is actually one of my favorite things to use, and I use it actually in pen tests and red teams now. So how many people use a proxy server or something like WebSense or Blue Code or something in your environment? So it's a common thing. Do you block categories of stuff, like you can't go to gambling websites or something like that? So that's something that we find that's really common, and we also find that organizations will block, like, say, raw IP or something like that. So sometimes we run into some outbound filtering based on categorization of domains, and it's actually not difficult to bypass. So what you need is a domain, right, to call out to for your payload for command and control. Well, you can go to expireddomains.net and find something that's recently expired, and that's also categorized by, like IT or healthcare or something of that nature. And then on top of that, it's actually trivial to create a certificate that's trusted by default through something called Let's Encrypt, right? So I can actually create legitimate, categorized traffic for my payload out of an environment with a legitimate cert that's trusted by the Microsoft Store. And expireddomains.net is basically a free service that go find these domains. So one of the I think most fun, it's almost like a hobby for me, is when I find a hash, I just want to crack it. It's in my nature, right? If I see something that looks like hash, it's something, it just wants to be cracked, right? So how do you go about gathering hashes in an environment? There are actually a number of ways, because in a Microsoft environment, you can get, just by the way that SMB works, you can get hashes from just asking a machine questions. So one of my favorite attacks when I get a foothold in a network is something called curb roasting. This was invented by a friend of mine named Tim Medine. And it was released, 2014 or something at Hackfest, Sans Hackfest. And so the Microsoft curb roast implementation, we could probably talk about that for the rest of the time we have, because it's actually really complicated. The gist of it is that any domain user can make a request for, or can query what's called a service principal name on a network. And the part of the curb roast ticket they get back, the TGT ticket, has an encrypted representation. The ticket has a part that has an encrypted representation of the NTLM hash of the service. So like a SQL service is really common, where that Kerberos service, where that service lives. So essentially what it boils down to is that any user in the environment can get a hash that can be cracked, and taken offline and cracked. And so however long they have to do that. So let's say you have a SQL server that's running in your environment. Any valid domain account can go get a ticket through Kerberos, and that ticket that comes back can be taken offline and attempted to crack. I have gotten straight out domain administrator out of the gate in 5 minutes into a test with this attack. And because the SQL Server service account absolutely had to be domain admin for some reason, right? And even if it's just the service where the server is, the SQL Server, the service account's typically an administrator. So at the very least, I become admin on the server, right? So I remember one time I did this attack, and it was a client we had done, at least the third or fourth test we had done, and they had been fixing everything. And I performed this attack, and there was an old SQL Server in their environment, and it had a password of corn with a capital K. Yes, like the band, but not backwards, but So a lot of times, administrators, look, I used to be a systems administrator in a previous life. I get if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But a lot of times organizations just overlook making service accounts complicated or changing service account passwords. I've seen service accounts that have had valid passwords for like 10, or no password change for like 10 years. And how long would it take me to crack, a 10-character password? Well, if I had 10 years, what does it matter? I'm probably going to crack it in 10 years, right? So Kerber roasting is fun. Another way that I can get a hash is if your wireless environment. So how many people have wireless at work? You don't have to raise your hands because it's everybody now, right? If you don't have wireless where you work, I feel sorry for you. I'm sorry. Wireless is just everywhere now. And so usually what people do in an enterprise environment is they use WPA2 Enterprise. And so there aren't ways to attack WPA2 Enterprise like WPA2. There's no handshake to grab. But what you can do is you can set up what's called an evil twin wireless attack. So basically the idea is I create a hotspot or a wireless AP that's named the same as your corporate Wi-Fi access point. And if I can get a user to try and authenticate to my evil AP based on just the name, if it's not configured correctly, I can potentially get a NetNTLM v2 hash to crack. And this is another, I know I've said this is my favorite thing. This is also my favorite thing. Maybe it's all my favorite thing. So how many people do outbound port filtering in their environment? So you don't, yeah. So a lot of organizations still don't. They just think, hey, it doesn't, everything in my internal network is trusted. There's no reason for me to filter traffic back out of the network. Well, I love it when I find TCP 445 open outbound in an environment, because that's, anybody, SMB? So if I find TCP 445 open outbound, I can set up an SMB listener on the internet, and I can go find a share that I have access to, which typically there's going to be some share. And in some environments, I love shares that everybody uses, like a temp dumping ground. Like, every employee can get to that share and just share stuff with whoever in whatever department, because I can create a weaponized shortcut file. And so that shortcut file, you put it out in that share, and you create the icon, or the icon in that link points out to my malicious server. And when someone just views the shortcut in Explorer, it tries to go grab the icon, it tries to authenticate to the server with a NetNTLM v2 hash. And I can even send this kind of thing in email, right? Like, the possibilities are endless. Like I said, this is another one of my favorite attacks.
So here's a few various attacks and things that we would do when we go on-site. A lot of these things we've talked about so far have been remote attacks, or things that we could do over the internet. So one thing that we find pretty often on a lot of the pen tests we're doing these days are network access control ports that are locked down on most of the networks we test. So what NAC is basically the concept of preventing unauthorized devices from being plugged into your network. And essentially the way it does that is it usually has some sort of profiling that happens so that the devices that get plugged in, if they don't match your organization's profiles, then they just get knocked off to like a separate VLAN or something. So one of the obvious ways that we get around this is just find a printer and just copy the MAC address of that, or just plug into the port, because oftentimes the printers and various VoIP phones on most of these pen tests we're on don't have the ability to install like certificates for for the NAC to authenticate with. And so that's one of the easier ways. There's a tool called VoIP Hopper that works really well to hop from VLAN to VLAN as well. On Wi-Fi based 802.1x NAC networks, a lot of times you can find like iPhone devices that are connected, and the cool thing about Wi-Fi is you can see the MAC addresses through Wi-Fi. Ooh, I think somebody just got some Wi-Fi going up in here. And then another thing that's kind of interesting to point out here is that you can actually bypass NAC if you can situate yourself in between an authenticated device using an actual like layer 2 and layer 3 based control. So it's a rather old script these days. It's called Beagle in the middle. It's a Python script that actually will listen to both sides of the wire and basically simulate what the wall is to the computer and what the computer is to the wall. So you're essentially sitting at like a bridge point in between an authenticated 802.1x device. So this is a Dropbox that we wrote an article how to build. This is an Odroid C2. I need to update it with maybe one of the newer Odroids that they've released recently, but the Odroid C2 is pretty awesome. This is a very powerful little system, and I believe it's still under $100 to build this. But it's basically like the idea of creating like a pwn plug of sorts. Creating a device that has a Linux-based distribution that can call out either over the cell signal that maybe you have hooked up through a 4G adapter, over Wi-Fi. You can control it directly over Wi-Fi if you have if you're close enough to it. So the idea would be you sneak into an office, plug this in under a desk somewhere, nobody notices, but it's plugged into the network. Pixie booting attacks. I threw this image in here primarily because this was me and Derek Tuesday at Busch Gardens on the Battle of Ire right there. It was awesome. And there were pixies. Pixie booting attacks. So on a lot of networks that are very large in scale, what a lot of organizations do is they actually enable systems to boot to an image, like a golden image, over Pixie. And one of the attacks that we do sometimes when we get on site is just set a virtual machine to boot over the network, and it will query for those images. And a lot of times we can get that Pixie boot image directly from the network, and then boot that VM, maybe snapshot it, and then go steal admin hashes from it. So you can perform a lot of different attacks, like mounting the actual storage from the VM itself, and grabbing the admin hashes from the nt.dit file. You could set the local admin password to just completely bypass authentication altogether, and then you could also overwrite sticky keys to do something like pop up a command shell. All right, post exploitation.
So PowerUp SQL is a project written by Ken Sutherland, I think. The reason we threw this in here is for it's sort of like Mail Sniper in a way where if you get into an environment and there are 400 SQL servers and you're trying to find the sensitive data, so the best choice of action is to install SQL Enterprise Manager and go look at each one of them one at a time, right? No, that's a terrible idea. So PowerUp SQL does a number of things, but I think one of the best things that it does is it allows you to search for data in databases that you have access to at scale. And that's really powerful, right? Because as an attacker or as a red teamer, I really a lot of times might not know where the sensitive data is. And so I can throw in terms to look for that sensitive data or to look for other types of data. So using this tool in the past, I found clear text credit card numbers. That was a good one. I found social security numbers. I found passwords. And then also used it to find the data that the client was asking for us to find. So that's one of the things that it does. It also has modules for privilege escalation. Again, as I mentioned before, as a previous systems administrator, a lot of times SQL is an overlooked thing. It's some kind of database that you're given 2 days to stand it up, and it had to be live yesterday, so you just configure it improperly. And so PowerUp SQL will help you find some of those issues in configuration, like over-privileged users, things of that nature. So living off the land. So as an attacker, if I want to fly under the radar, I'll use some of the commands that are just built into Windows. those commands, how many people do command line logging in their environment? Yeah, I see a couple of hands, right? So in your environment, how common is it for folks to run, like, say, net commands? Everybody, especially like accounting, they run net commands, right? Or maybe encoded PowerShell. Like if I send some PowerShell commands and there's a big, long base64 encoded PowerShell, that seems really common too,
They should definitely be
right?
running that, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? That seems totally legit, right? So you can use built-in Windows features to do, copy files back and forth across the network, and even use something like WMIC to move laterally. So here are just a couple of examples. I mean, there's like an entire GitHub project now called LOL binaries, where there's a lot of stuff in Microsoft that, I mean, I'm sure someone at Microsoft knows what it does, but like it just seems like that Windows is such a big project now that no one person knows it all. And so there are all these binaries that have some, let's just say, maybe unintended or undocumented features. But just, here are a couple of commands. Like I said, net commands. You can use dir to list files remotely. That seems really useful. And then WinRM, like I mentioned WMIC, I mean, you can use WinRM to move laterally. So we were making fun of the Cyber-APT-Blinky-Box thing earlier, and I do that not because these companies are doing something bad, but because the way that they market and what I've seen other organizations do is they think it's some kind of silver bullet because they've been told that. So they're in fact not. They're just another layer of security. And so I won't mention the company's name, but you guys want to see the super sophisticated way I bypassed one of these next-gen AI Cyber-Blinky-Box things? How many people have heard of Netcat? Yeah, I shoveled a reverse shell with one of the agents running on a machine, and yeah, it was totally cool. No problem there.
We added this one in because this is actually something that I think I thought was a fairly well-known technique for dumping memory from a system. But I had a conversation with somebody last night, and it blew their mind that this is possible. So a lot of the next gen, actually most antiviruses these days will detect something like Mimikatz. And so let's say you want to run Mimikatz on a system without being able to because you're getting blocked or it's getting alerted on. You can create a dump file of the LSASS process and then just go run Mimikatz offline against it. And you can use the feature that's built into Microsoft to do it. All you have to do is open up Task Manager, right-click LSASS process, click Create Dump File. You now have a memory dump of the LSASS process that contains all the stuff you need to get clear text creds out of it with Mimikatz. All you have to do is get it offline and then go run it against it on a system that's not being protected.
They actually added that in Windows 7. You used to have to use proc dump. So I don't know why it would be added, and then, at least don't let you do the LSASS process, right?
Yeah, so we were talking earlier about using built-in commands. So we can get a little bit stealthier too by using built-in .NET direct queries instead of actually using PowerShell commands and command line commands. So a tool we wrote called Host Recon will do a lot of the typical a typical recon against a system, such as like figuring out what like data you could get back from like ipconfig, net commands, like figure out all the users from a domain, netstat, who am I, all that stuff, but without actually running any of those binaries. So a lot of times we'll alert on things like net users or things like ipconfig will get alerted on these days. So this tool will kind of get around that a little bit by doing it all through direct .NET queries. We made it to detection and prevention.
Yeah, wow, we actually still have time. So this talk would be pretty useless if we ended here and just said, okay, guys, that's great. Sorry you're all not able to do anything about any of this. And that's really not true. So I firmly believe that good security starts with solid systems administration. If you have a good systems administration team and they're doing what they should be doing, you have the foundation for what good security should be built on. So going through something like the 20 critical controls, it starts with systems administration. Know what is in your environment. Know your machine names, know what software is there, and then set up alerts if something is not in that baseline. It's really easy for me to say that. I realize it takes like 6 years to implement, but you know, you should still get there eventually, right? If you want to make me have a really, really bad day as an attacker, prevent all your workstations from talking to each other. I think that would probably make me cry. And there are a number of ways to do it. One way is Cisco has a feature called private VLANs. If you enable private VLANs, your workstations won't be able to talk to each other. You can also do it with something like a Windows, host-based firewall, right? But again, this is like good systems administration. This isn't like a Cyber-APT-Blinky-Box. I don't get concerned really when I see those things. I get concerned when I find out that lateral movement is not going to happen, right? It takes an entire attack category away. In good systems administration, workstations should talk to servers. They shouldn't talk to other workstations. So and that gets to like baseline images with GPO enforcement. Again, if you know what should be there and you look for what shouldn't be there, security becomes a little bit easier, right? And then everything that comes into your network and everything that goes out of your network should go through some application level proxy. And the reason I say that is because we've been in environments that have no proxy server. They just allow their workstations to talk out port 80 and 443. And so what if if those are the two ports that are open and everything else is filtered? I mean, I have to talk HTTP through that port 80, right? No, I don't. I can just talk raw TCP, or I can encrypt traffic, and it doesn't even have to look like HTTP. But if you send it through a proxy, and that proxy doesn't allow anything that's not HTTP or something that the traffic should look like, it makes me have a worse day. So good user behavior. We didn't really talk about phishing. That was sort of in the first talk, right? But so when you have email come inbound to a user, tag the subject line for external, and don't tell your users not to click on links. That is actually terrible advice, because we say don't click on links, it's bad, don't click on links, and then what do? The security team sends out an email with a link in it. So don't click on links except for the good ones. No one's ever going to do well at that, right? But what you could do is say, hey, look, if you get an email with an external tag, that means it didn't come from our organization. Be suspicious of that email and links that might be in that email. And then probably one of the easiest changes to make is the one that has the most political, in an organization challenge, and that is stop using 8-character passwords. If you put your password complex or password character length to 15 or more characters, that takes away. It makes it a lot harder for me to try and guess a password with something like password spraying, or if I do end up getting a hash, if it's a 15-character password, it is going to take me forever to crack. It's just going to take exponentially longer than if it was an 8-character password. And then, consider, additional credential defense. Last year at DerbyCon, we released a project called Cred Defense Toolkit, where it was, one of the parts of it was a password filter that set on your domain controller that had a list of banned words. So even if you upped your, password character length to 8 characters or 15 characters, it doesn't really take away the entire ability for someone to choose a really poor password. We joked about summer 2018. Well, what if I did summer 2018? That's longer than 15 characters. It's still a really terrible password. But if you blacklist the word summer, or all the seasons, all the months, it becomes a little bit more difficult as an attacker. And there are commercial offerings that do this as well. So I saw a couple of hands when I asked about host log consolidation. So when I first started at Black Hills, the first couple of years, I was kind of getting a little depressed because it just seemed really easy. Like I kept being successful. I never was caught. I'm like, oh man, this is kind of depressing, right? And then last year, I got caught a handful of times. And every time I got caught, it was because of endpoint log consolidation. The endpoint, users' workstations, that's where all the bad stuff happens, right? if you're logging what's happening on those workstations, like I was talking about net commands earlier, if you have an alert for any time someone runs a net command, it might not be bad, but it's certainly something that should be investigated. Also, PowerShell V5. If you're running Windows 10, you can already do this. Windows 7, if you want to know how to do it in Windows 7, come see me after this talk. You can log all PowerShell execution to the Windows event log. And also there's a product called Sysmon that's put out, it's sysinternals. That gives you a whole lot more visibility than the default that's delivered with Windows. And one other point on that. So that could actually be a whole talk in itself. I wrote a blog post on how to do endpoint log consolidation on the cheap. I say on the cheap instead of free. Everything is free, but you still need a server, and so it's not really free, right? So if you're interested in doing this with things that Microsoft provides you, then that blog post will help you. And by the way, the slides will be posted after this. And also, I was talking about network logging, or host-based logging. It's still really important to log on the network. So in my previous life doing IR, I was an unapologetic Bro fanboy. How many people use Bro? Yeah. So if you're doing network monitoring or network forensics and you're not using Bro, it's my opinion that you're doing it wrong. Bro is, there's no other like commercial product that's even like it, well, except for the guys that now, I guess the Bro authors do have an appliance, so that's not entirely true now. But you can still do it open source. And so out of the box, it's sort of like running a text-based Wireshark on your network, and default protocols or common protocols are just logged to text file. And you get, usually when you first see a Bro log and what's actually running on your network, you have to get up, walk away from the computer, take a little break, come back, you look again, you're like, what is this? It's an eye-opening experience. And also, it can provide some visibility into SSL. You can like start doing something like SSL fingerprinting, where if an attacker is using encrypted traffic, if they're using HTTPS, unless you're breaking HTTPS, you might think that there's limited visibility there. You can use something like JA3 from Salesforce to fingerprint SSL certificates. And it's actually, if certificates used for malware look a lot different than certificates used for people actually just browsing the internet. And then there's a project that we have for free as well called Rita. And what that will do is it'll take Bro logs and ingest them and look for beacons inside of the traffic. So it looks for essentially machine traffic being generated for something like malware, although Windows updates look like malware too. Maybe they are malware. So if something's beaconing in your network, it might not be bad, but it might be something that you need to go take a look at. And so the whole point of this talk was for us to tell you to become a red team prepper. Take these things and go figure out how to implement them in your environment. There's a number of resources that you can use, like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Red Canary is now kind of automating some of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and you can start testing to see if your detection capabilities will find some of these attacks, right? Find what the nation-state actors are doing, and by the time you have that red team come, perhaps you will catch them.
That is it.
So